So what I'm doing is I'm filming over a performance that I made and filmed yesterday, and it took considerable time to get up on the web, but I didn't notice that the version that I put up had a name and a telephone number, and that name and telephone number in one of the used books may or may not, still be relevant. But because it's private information, I want to make a new version, and I hadn't saved the old copy because, well, basically because all of my technology is hacked, and it's very difficult for me to create anything, and all of the hacking,
playing with the idea that you can't judge a book by its cover. I'm going to determine
forces me to eliminate a lot of data just to make room for anything new that I'm making, and this form of harassment is very familiar to me, and so I get used to having to get rid of things just to continue to create and to work, and so I didn't keep the original that I could have edited very easily. So now I'm having to film over to correct this, and the advantage to filming it over is that I can make certain observations about what I did in the performance, and what I left out, and how memory and intention in that performance played itself out, and the commentary now in this space-time can make observations, sort of double back on what I was doing there.
And of course,
and one of the things that I did or failed to do or failed to remember was in constructing this set or
activity
series of designations of these pronouns, I had failed to include whole classes of pronouns. So, like relative pronouns and possessive pronouns. And then at one point I went back and I included the pronoun those, but interestingly, I failed to add these. So part of that difficulty, I think, and in processing or accounting for all of these various pronouns was the fact that I was narrating other parts of my life while I was constructing the sets. But the point of it is that in terms of social
I was thinking about
social sorting, once these categories are created, they become reified in ways that even if they're incomplete, or even if they're partial, or even if they misrepresent the world, one is still sorted into their misrepresentations of the world, right? So here I'm recognizing that I forgot a category, or not a category, but a pronoun that fit into my category of pronouns, which is it. So we added that, and then I believe that the next one that I'll add is those, but interestingly, I failed to add these, right? So the social relevance and significance of having categories that are limited or fail to account for the world is that those things that are unaccounted for become marginalized, and it's no fault of the marginalized subjects, but of the failure of the categories themselves, to fully encompass the scope of the world and the possibilities of positions in that world.
By judgments that can be made of them from their also thinking about this essay by Walter Benjamin, one of my favorite essays of all.
And of course, I no longer have this essay either because it was lost in one of these moves in which the shape of the library changed. And
unpack this library in a similar way to the way that, in addition to sorting by pronoun, to unpack it in a similar
And of
way.
course, I'm talking about the changing shape of my library because it relates to all of these ideas of marginalized positionalities and the difficulty that
he sorts his library in unpacking.
some of those of us who have been sorted have in, maintaining jobs, careers, lives, livelihoods in societies that create, myths and fables of equality and
historical significance and relates it to the psychology
and this
the psychology of reading, the psychology of belonging,
universal
identifying.
democracy, in which, and not only democracy, but this sort of universal, secure, space of capitalist, potentiality and possibility in which there are no, biases that exclude individuals from, becoming whatever they wish to be, and my stories of the destruction and transformations of the library relate to that myth and the debunking of that myth.
And identified by what is seen on their covers, at least in this dimension.
I'm talking now about how I intend to do with this piece, multiple things and, do things simultaneously. So I'll be sorting these books by the pronouns that are on their covers, and then so I'm playing with that expression, sorting, judging, by the cover of the book by the cover, and how that relates to
these three
judging individuals by their covers, which and that could mean a number of different things.
of the library.
And I'm talking about also
The history of the loss of certain
this
elements of the library begins
this essay by Walter Benjamin, in which he discusses how he acquired the books in his library and why he acquired them and when he acquired them, and how that relates to memory and economics and value in certain ways, and I'm beginning to talk about the history of my library.
to begin graduate school in comparative literature, and the library grew. And then my wife also was going to school, and she was doing first undergraduate work in history, and then a little bit of graduate work in history, and a lot of graduate work in the philosophy of education. So in that period that we were in,
So I'm talking about how I had to reduce the library at one point, but then once I moved from California to New York, the library began to increase again in the course of my time in graduate school and my wife's time there as an undergraduate in history and as a graduate student in the philosophy of education.
Before we moved back to California,
And I had already pointed out, what a small library it is, and I'm leading up to the reason that it is such a small, library.
So that was
But it involves all of these, moments of economic crisis.
and one of the reasons that we had to move was because I was finding it really difficult to get a job in New York, and one of the obstacles was that. had difficulties all along the way that are complex.
And some of those difficulties, had to do with, testing and the way individuals are sorted by testing. Some of them had to do with, filling out applications. Some of them had to do with job duties and expectations. Some of them had to do with, requirements. For example, if you teach in literature or an area in the humanities, you still have to, the expectation is that you still have to have taken a certain amount of college algebra, and I had avoided doing that because of dyscalculia. And then when I did it, it took me longer than it would for most individuals. So I spent 5 years taking math classes and getting through those math classes. But by the end of the 5 years, no one wants to hire you because the expectation is, well, like, if you graduated with this degree in education, why did you take 5 years off, right? And you can't really explain to people that, well, because it took me that long to get through the math classes that I needed to get through to get certified in education, right? So, yeah, well, too bad.
On the internet or somewhere else, which later, I lost most of that as well. We lost. So what we had was, a few clothes, a car, and a feral cat that we had managed to.
So I'm talking about a period of homelessness at this time, because I was unable to find work, and
at that point the library, no longer existed at all, and then with these, few clothes and a vehicle.
And so that's a point at which, my wife and I, Lori and I, lost, everything that we had. And so the library essentially had no content at that time. And that was 2012.
That was around
2012. He wants to say 2012. He's about to say it.
2012.
There you go.
And then, of course, at that point, we began a new library.
And that would have, we built this library up when we were living in Round Rock, which is, fairly isolated, and the nearest bookstore is, maybe more than 100 miles away, or around that, around 100 miles, and so it's a slow process, and a lot, and even those bookstores that were available in that area in Farmington or in Gallup, are largely used bookstores.
We lost that house because we lost our.
Okay, so now I'm talking about after my mother died, and
Res Dogs.
How we moved to Santa Fe. I had to leave part of the library behind again, but her library was incorporated with my library at that time. And I'm talking about how we lost that house because we brought these res dogs that we had rescued with us, and we lost our homeowner's insurance because of that. And then
a new property,
and then we moved to California, so that we could keep the dogs, and
it turned out not to be so much, but
the library changed again.
At that point, I guess we had gotten used to the idea of a shape-shifting library, and the idea of having less. So at this time, most of the volumes that I have, I mean, there's really a lot of history in them, and some of them I don't even know, but many of them have been acquired from thrift stores and used bookstores.
And hence the trouble and why I'm redoing the video, because when I was sorting, by these different categories and discussing the history of the library and its acquisitions, I had failed to notice the personal information that was on one of these books that I'm going to try to avoid this time.
Shallow size and lightweight dimensions of the library, which in some ways makes it easier, to sort the items.
So I'm trying to find some
so
rationale for,
what I do is
being optimistic about the small size of the library. Makes it easier for me to sort now, right? So.
and along the way, I'll recount if I can recall,
And I have a surprisingly poor memory of especially compared to Benjamin, of how I acquired these volumes and when I acquired these volumes. And
if I can't remember, I might speculate.
And I do speculate, but there are some obvious things that I don't speculate about. Like, for example, there's like this price in one of the volumes. It's this one that's coming up, and I know that.
So this one doesn't seem to have any pronouns on it.
And the reason that, okay, so this is a really high priced book for a used book, and must belong to some community in which
There's a possessive pronoun, but I didn't use possessive pronoun.
in which books are used books are overvalued for some reason.
It didn't occur to me.
One thing about this particular volume that I should clarify is I focus on the way that the note in the book designates it as Native American, and I refer to that as provincial. And the reason that I refer to it as provincial is because
It could be there. Could have been.
Scott Momaday, to me, is first and foremost a writer and an author, and he happens to be a Native American author. But this isn't an example for me of Native American Americana. Or I wouldn't sort that way. Sorting that way automatically designates for me
In a collection of sortable designations, and
how to describe it. Here's Fiverr.
and because I didn't do that, we're faced with a problem unless I can find.
For example, you wouldn't sort under classics, that Socrates was an Athenian, and then some other Greek came from elsewhere. That wouldn't even occur to you. This
could have been sorted into another.
It automatically belongs to this designation of the classics. But sorting, Native American out first, that being the thing, rather than recognizing it as primarily falling under the domain of literature, is an example of sociological sorting. And that sorting belongs to colonialism, right? And that's I don't state all of that in what I do, but that's what I'm recognizing in the way that this word is inscribed in this text and how it's been sorted into this category first. So first of all, like the category it begins from this positionality that's non-native, right? Like this is native to someone who is not, and then the idea of it being literature is entirely forgotten in the designation. And here's the price that I'm talking about. All right, so first of all, like this, that price represents that this is like an exotic object, that it would be like hard to find, which it's not hard to find, right? So
that's not the case. So I have to imagine that this was acquired somewhere provincial,
and this is what I'm trying to get at.
Backwards, and I'm gonna want to say somewhere in Southern California.
Like for example, like here on the Navajo Nation, right? If you went into a Navajo craft store, like you wouldn't see anything labeled Native American, because the assumption is like, well, obviously, right? So there's no obviousness here that this is literature.
It's possible this was acquired. There is a used bookstore in Julian, California, that this could have been acquired in. But I'm not sure. It could have been acquired in Santa Fe when I was there, but
I'm actually sure that it wasn't acquired in Santa Fe. Nearly positive.
It has a different designation. It could have been acquired in a thrift store run by ARC.
I'm sure that it wasn't acquired there either. It wouldn't have been that expensive. And then, as I mentioned later, at a certain point, ARC in Farmington actually were giving books away and not charging anything for them, especially loyal and
we'll have a lot of Calvino because
regular customers to the ARC.
Authors, and almost all of the Calvino was acquired probably mail order, and it may have been while I was still. Now I don't use Amazon.com anymore because of the politics of Amazon's response to the COVID crisis, and also how difficult they make it to unionize. I'm not a big fan of Jeff Bezos.
So the other thing that this particular sorting structure allows me to do is that it allows me to narrate outside of the structure of sorting as well, and how these other industries and technologies of sorting, like Bezos algorithms and stuff, provide you with information, but also perform other tasks, right? So.
Was probably acquired online, unless it was acquired. Nothing would have survived from New York, so it had to be acquired late. And I know
so you could look at Bezos efforts to defeat unionization as a kind of strategy against self-organization, right, and self-sorting and organizations that take up apparatuses of oppression and inequality, and they relate very much to the way that opportunities are distributed in under capitalism in American culture, right? So relate to this entire project of sorting by pronoun, and by sorting by positionality, and by sorting by life history and experience, and
you can see how sorting and where you end up depends on what you include and allow. What you include and allow.
So what I'm talking about right here is that a lot of these covers have pronouns, but they're not the pronouns that I included in my set. Like, for example, possessive pronouns, different kinds of relative pronouns, and these whole categories of pronouns that I overlooked and failed to provide. And so I'm having problems sorting, but the sorting goes on, right? Whether there are like places for these things or not, like just like with the people, like you get sorted whether there's a place for you or not. So I'm talking about in some way, obliquely, but I'm talking about the way that these categories become reified, and then myths of opportunity and equality are basically invented to account for the discrepancy, and words like lazy and whatever people call people that have failed to find a fit. You know, bum might be a word, you know, really particularly offensive word or whatever. These constructs are there to justify the failures of the sorting categories themselves, right? And the fact that they don't really account for the word. I'm discussing marginalia here and what it means, and there's also some like cryptic references in the way that I discuss marginalia. That, you know, those of, you know, my close readers will you know, discern what those references are, and I don't really wish to entirely give away here because
of the something. The heart of the maiden is counter. I can't read the counter something, and then, but that counter. Maybe it's not a counter. And then that's placed, that word that I can't quite make out. The heart of the maiden is something in quotation marks, and then it says trickster / cunning.
And that relates, you know, in some ways to another recent video that I made that has this cartoon, you know, fox avatar, and the idea of, you know, fox and coyote, Renard and coyote as trickster, and, you know, relates to this whole tradition of the trickster and the way that the Alfred, okay, you know, the Alfred FYI, you know, living theater experience, you know, has used the trickster to reveal certain things that might otherwise, you know, be difficult to reveal if they weren't revealed in this, you know, particular masked and cunning form.
So far we have it and we have it and they, that. Surprising number of it's, actually. All right, let's see.
Okay, I think this one, yeah, so this is the one I have to be, well, I have to be very careful with this one because I don't want to reveal the information. This is the whole reason why we
descriptions.
Let me see if I can get it.
Guess that this was discovered somewhere.
There, I got the title now without revealing the personal information, so you can stay down here.
And one of the places that I like, there were a number of good thrift stores and bargain stores in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but one of my favorite was one that had opened up newly, you know, when in the brief time that I was there, which was, I can't remember what it was called, but it was run by the Big Brothers and Big Sisters organization, and they had an excellent collection of used books, and I'm going to guess that this was acquired there. And I was fond of the Big Brothers and Sisters organization because of, you know, growing up without.
So here's another example of the way that
I actually belong to.
I can tell stories, you know, using this structure and, you know, connecting to various aspects of
So we used to go
memory,
a lot of the,
you know, based on places and
whatever, when we kind of were forced to move from Santa Fe because of the res dogs.
and ownerships. You know, in this instance, I'm talking about my relationship as a child to the Big Brothers and Big Sisters organization, because this particular used thrift store, you know, this thrift store was run by the organization Big Brothers and Big Sisters.
We're only using 2 of these categories so far.
And in that way, I'm not unaware on the metacognitive level that I'm using these books in a similar way to the way that Italo Calvino uses the tarot cards to tell stories in
from, I believe that
the Castle of Cross Destinies, right? And he uses similar devices in other
distributor other than Amazon
narratives that he creates. And again, here's another story that I'm able to tell because I fail to remember where I bought this. I can discuss Amazon.com again and
I'm positive that this was purchased online.
and why we might want to boycott
while we were
Amazon.com.
Chitty, New Mexico, also on the Navajo Nation.
So memory becomes a means of exploring space as well, and the history of space, those spaces that one occupies, but also the failure of memory also becomes a means of exploring space and time and the histories and the economies and the inequalities of space and time. And I'm performing that, without explicitly saying it. So in a way, it's an example of showing, and now I'm telling, one could say. But even in the telling that I'm performing now, right, there's a showing. And so if I narrate over this particular
relating to
telling, then this telling will become a showing, and that narrating will become a telling.
Women's experience in this particular author, and particularly,
So the showing and the telling isn't so much an ontological, aspect of the way that we reveal as it is a relationship to what we're revealing. And that relates to the idea of sorting too, and all of the ways in which sorting reifies these things into these categories of things like showing and telling, right? In which it depends really on the way that you look at it. For example, like this looks this way if I hold the camera here, but it looks an entirely different way if I hold the camera on the other side.
In Farmington as well. Probably at ARC. At one point, ARC.
Now again, that's got to be wrong because the price is too high.
That both hires and provides other resources and donations to individuals with disabilities, and the one that we used to frequent was in Farmington, New Mexico. At one point, all of the books that they collected, they began to give me for free. I would come in and I would buy other things from them, and the books they wouldn't charge me for.
So I've played a lot, with the designation ARC, and it relates to a number of different discourses that I've been working with, and I've drawn the arc of Farmington, New Mexico into that play of signification without overly and explicitly identifying the way that it functions within all of those different interlocking narratives.
It's one of my favorite places to frequent in Farmington. I'm not a huge fan of Farmington, New Mexico, but thrift store was fantastic, and also it was a pleasure, conversing with the workers in that particular store and location, and usually some interesting customers as well, and very big open space. Highly recommended. So the price though, it really poses an obstacle to my reading.
There you go. So I'm finally recognizing that it's unlikely that I purchased this at ARC because the price is a giveaway. So.
It could be Santa Fe as well. That high price, suggests maybe somewhere with a larger middle class population than Farm to New Mexico had, and I would suspect Santa Fe then. All right. So did we find a pronoun?
Still looking for a pronoun for this particular volume.
I. Okay, so I. This is an I book. So I mean, and it really is an I book, right? It's like astrology. Astrology is all about the ego, right? Like, who am I? And that's why everybody loves it, because it's like a fortune cookie. Like, tell me about myself, right? And it doesn't really matter. The human psychology is such as this. If you're told that you're being told about yourself, you'll find yourself in it, right? So that's why it's so appealing.
Yeah, right. So it is, for example, so the best way to get published is to write a poem about your publisher, right? And it doesn't really matter what it is, but just put dedicate the poem to the publisher, and it'll get published, right? So this is a strategy you can use.
This is another one that I'm almost positive. I think all of the Butler was acquired or reacquired because with all of the losses.
This is and it's a strategy that outsiders are aware of, right? So that you ingratiate yourself to the system, to the sorting system in a certain way, although secretly that you really find it offensive.
Her. I really wish I would have included possessive pronouns in our sorting, but once the categories are made, that's how it works. If there's no place for you to be sorted, you get sorted outside. So we didn't.
I'm failing to find this pronoun she for some reason. I guess I'm focused on what I'm narrating, or the way that I'm narrating it, or where I'm. There we go.
So it's interesting that only Octavia Butler seems to be getting sorted into she. It's so interesting to me. Okay. All right. So this definitively, I know where this comes from. This was one of my mother's books. I know this was one of my mother's books. I probably wouldn't buy a collection like this, but I like that she did, and that she had it in her library. So this is one of the books from her library that I kept, and so this book entered my library after my mother died. 13, and my wife and I, had to leave the nation to go to her property in Santa Fe, and to take care of all the elements of the estate. And so this volume belongs to that moment, when we moved there with the res dogs, before we, effectively, had to find a new home for them. Because, they were deemed problematic animals, and we lost her homeowner's insurance on that place, and also the bank, Wells Fargo. We had all kinds of problems with them. Initially, the first problem was that they wouldn't, let us take over even though we had, inherited enough money to do so, but they wouldn't let us take over the loan, because we didn't have really hard credit, and then we weren't even allowed, to make payments. The payments were overdue because, she had passed away, and then there's all this legal stuff, and trying to get her, she didn't own the house outright, she still had a mortgage on it, and it was really problematic. It was too difficult really to deal with, and I would certainly never use Wells Fargo again. I had felt like basically they, made a pretty aggressive attempt, to steal the home from us, and that was unpleasant and certainly disturbing. So this was acquired at that time. I actually like this volume. It's one of those books that I would never have purchased on my own, but quite like it. I like the history of it because of what we're doing with it as well. Alright, so we're going to look for a pronoun. You. That's a good one. This is you. This sorting is really taking a lot longer than I had imagined. Okay, now this one's not mine. This is my wife Lori's book. Because she's a teacher, she has a lot of children's books. Artemis Fowl, obviously this belongs to the Harry Potter series.
And apparently it doesn't belong to the Harry Potter series, at least according to the designation of the author.
I have no idea when or how she acquired this volume. I know why, but I have no idea when. So if we have a pronoun.
And sometimes I would, play with the material elements of the text, like it says, you can't really see it, but it says you don't know what, why. And so I would let that enter my narrative of the account of the book and perform in the connect the narrative of remembering with the material content of the item remembered in a way that
isn't part of what Walter Benjamin does, but is part of the way that I work, and like I enjoy confusing the domains of those realities in a Raymond Queneau kind of way, but unlike Raymond Queneau, in a way that brings socially politically relevant material to the surface, and so my confusion about this book being, written by J.K. Rowling, and the fact that, that confusion is based on
the success
on the name itself, and this kind of Harry Potter-esque name that I recognize in Artemis Fowl, which still seems to me very Harry Potter, and you don't know what you're dealing with, become part of the performance and become part of the narrating. So the narrating and the performance are, in that sense, meta-narrating and meta-performing, because they allow, the transparency that should exist, between the object and the narration of the object to become opaque and confused and overlap, and that transparency becomes more like a series of veils and interconnected.
This one's easy, isn't it? Okay, so this is.
I don't know if we can still see that, but this is a Goodwill sticker.
And I know where this was acquired. This was acquired in the Goodwill in Gallup, New Mexico. Also, when we were living in Chitty.
So the sneezing you hear is in my time, and that's Fiverr, and it's not in the time of the telling.
2020 and the beginning of 2021 sometime. I was doing a lot of work with big stone at that time, and I had done stacking pieces, a lot of stacking pieces, beginning from childhood. But and these stacking pieces involved it's just kind of a form of prayer and memory, in which you mourn or hope or request, or record a desire for change, or just in terms of the remembering, you record a moment in the act of composing the stacking of stones, and they can be done as memorials, or they can be done as requests, and these were requests that I had done in Mass Chitty, requests for clean environment, including free of the contamination of toxic uranium, because there's a lot of radioactive contamination and contagion in this part of the Navajo Nation, because uranium was mined, in the great nuclear age following the destruction of part of our world by nuclear material, and all of the profit-bearing industry that could be maintained exploiting this resource, and as a result, Navajo people in Navajo Nation and other Native Americans in the area, continue to suffer the deleterious effects of this exploitation of this particular, quote unquote, resource. And so, over in Nashchitty, the stones that had been stacked stones, but because there were so many young children in the area, that I was concerned that they could be hurt, by the stacked stones if the stones were to fall, if the children play near them. So that they just became a line of stones, in an arroyo that eventually will wash them all away when there's enough rain. If there's enough rain in our world, following this period of increased global devastation caused by climate change, that so many individuals continue to deny, even though we knew in some way that this was happening. And at least I remember knowing as early as 1970 that this was happening. And so anyway, this was acquired at the same time that I was working with large, heavy stones as requests, or you could say prayers, for and I request for assistance in creating a world and an environment free of these toxins. And I wanted it to be big, big enough that it could be seen from the sky, and a number of reasons for it being the value of it being seen from the sky. I'm not finding a pronoun.
And of course, the reason that I'm not finding a pronoun is because I'm so intent upon talking about the work that I had done with stones in Nashchitty, and the function of that work as a kind of request and prayer, for eliminating these obstacles to a healthy environment in the lives of Native Americans and other Americans that suffer the deleterious effects of industry and its irresponsibility in maintaining the health and life of our planet, which is a great part of the work that I do. And this is why I'm having such a hard time locating a pronoun, or recognizing the fact that there are no pronouns in the categories that I've created on the cover of this particular book. But it gives me a way of excluding this particular book from the possibility of sorting, which was another point of this particular performance, to demonstrate that depending on how fragilely the constructs that one is sorting into are created, there will be, examples of objects and individuals that fall outside of the parameters of those sorting mechanisms, and in this instance, this happens to be one of those. And then it also allows me to return to this other narrative.
This particular book and we'll end here because we're approaching we're over 55 minutes, and we're approaching what I'd like to concede to as a time limit, which is an hour, although I sometimes exceed that. But for purposes of getting this up, we'll end here, and we can sort some more at a different time. But this particular book, as I was saying, apparently can't be judged by its cover, at least not so far as pronouns are concerned.